Professor Levitsky, I'd like to start with you, and I'd like you to turn your gaze to the United States. You and Professor Ziblatt have written about Trump as an authoritarian. He rejects democratic institutions, denies the legitimacy of his opponents, tolerates violence, curtails civil liberties. I want to ask you to judge the response of the American public to these violations and discuss what that says about the strength or the weaknesses of democratic norms in the United States.
Sure. I mean, the principal response, the principal characteristic for me of the response, can you all hear me? Is the partisan polarization, the partisan filters through which we respond. So, a liberal Democrat looking at this, liberal Democrat with a small d, looking at this situation would hope that the vast majority of citizens would respond to abusive behavior by being appalled at it. But because of partisan and to some degree social media filters, we are responding in multiple but really polar different ways to these abuses. So it's so far, I mean, Trump was absolutely right during the campaign when he said he could, which avenue did he say he could shoot somebody on? And get a Fifth Avenue. He could shoot somebody on Fifth Avenue and get away with it. So far, we have not crossed the line at which the vast majority of Republican voters would say, okay, enough. And that's frightening. What it means is it's very difficult. I would say, unlike the Roosevelt court packing incident of 1937, unlike the Nixon scandal in the early 1970s, it's going to be much more difficult to build a broad multi-party or bipartisan coalition against an abusive government. So far, no matter what Trump does, roughly 40% of the electorate is okay with it.
You mentioned social media filters, and I want to probe a little deeper there.
Not my area of expertise.
Okay, but I'm going to ask anyways. Because I think it's fair to say that the media has played a role in this polarization, and I'd like to ask you how serious that has been and what role the media might have, if any, in rebuilding a center, if there is a role for the media in trying to reduce the polarization that you've described.
There is. I mean, we obviously have multiple media, and I think the media have played multiple roles, both positive and negative, throughout this whole period. There is growing evidence. Again, this is not my area of research, but there is growing evidence, experimental and other, that heavy exposure to partisan social media does, in fact, have a sort of echo chamber effect, does reinforce our beliefs, and there's some evidence that it has a polarizing effect, so that the more time that we spend in partisan, and particularly partisan social media, the more likely we are to have to adopt more extremist views. Research on that is still pretty incipient, but there's pretty good evidence that it has this polarizing effect. So that is not positive. I mean, I actually think that the mainstream, that U.S. democratic institutions have responded in mixed ways to the Trump presidency. They certainly have not failed across the board. I think the courts have performed relatively well, and I actually think that both civil society and what we call the mainstream media have responded relatively effectively. I think the role of an independent media, as Dani pointed out, in a liberal democracy, is to play a watchdog role, and that a good chunk of the media has done that reasonably well. The problem is that only part of society is listening. I'm not a media technological determinist. I'm not as pessimistic as some about we've been through periods of polarized partisan media before. We've been through periods of major technological change in the media, the rise of radio, people worried about that was going to give rise to demagogues, the rise of television, now the rise of social media. Polities have found ways of adapting. I I am not smart enough to see into the future to understand how our institutions and how our politicians will adapt. But I don't think it's, yeah, let me leave it at that.
Professor Rodrik, would you like to add something about the role of media in this? And
well, I don't have anything to add to what Steve said on that, but I think I would say that the polarization is has deeper structural roots, that I think we have been going through a number of very deep-seated economic transformations in the advanced democracies, partly having to do with deindustrialization, partly having to do with technological changes, partly having to do with globalization. That has created very significant, that has very significantly deepened either existing cleavages or have created new cleavages. Between groups that sort of broadly see that they're sort of the beneficiaries of this process. The groups that have the resources, the networks, the skills to benefit from global markets or the new trends in technologies, and groups that sort of feel stuck, that they're not necessarily benefiting from it. And this shows up, of course, in the most immediately as greater inequality in a number of societies in terms of economic inequality. But even when it doesn't show up in a significant way as economic inequality, it always shows up as a kind of social distance. A distance in terms of perceptions of social status, perceptions of whether the different elites or different groups really feel themselves as stakeholders in broader society, or they've simply deserted them, become part of this sort of cosmopolitan cloud, and also creates sort of a cognitive cleavage that these groups end up developing different stories about how the world works and what the government can and cannot do, and what influences their lives. And these stories have sort of completely have diverged. So the economic circumstances, the social circumstances, and cognitive, and this I think is deeply is in the first instance what's responsible for this polarization. I think to a large extent media is just sort of reflecting this rather than creating it.
Okay. Margaret Thatcher famously said that there's no such thing as society. There's men, there's women, there's families. I mean, is it fair to say that the rise of neoliberalism in Western economies, in addition to creating these resentments, it's also dissolved the sense of social bonds, of solidarity, and that in turn has repercussions for democracy. If we don't feel ourselves as part of a collective, that we have a stake in our neighbors and people we don't interact with on an intimate basis, that will weaken democratic norms. Is that?
I think I think Margaret Thatcher was famously wrong, and I think we are suffering some of the consequences of the inability to develop an alternative narrative in the 1980s to the neoliberal or market fundamentalist one, which itself arose because of the perceived failures in the 1970s of the sort of the Keynesian sort of social welfare consensus, and what happened is that corporations and employers that at one time perceived themselves as stakeholders in larger communities where they had to invest in their communities, they had to invest in their labor force, that they were part of a bigger collective. Began to think of themselves as either unwilling or unable to do that anymore. Unwilling because now they were fleeting corporations; they could go anywhere, and also unable because they were under this strong competitive pressure that they were competing in this global economy, and therefore they couldn't show the largesse to their labor force and couldn't pay their labor force decent wages and so forth. So whether it was unwillingness or inability, there was this dissolution of these bonds, which I do think has played a big role in this polarization.
During your talk, you mentioned or you highlighted that the successful transitions to democracy are more likely to happen when there are pre-existing liberal norms. That Britain was a liberal autocracy before it became a liberal democracy. I want to ask you, and I'd be keen to get Professor Levitsky's opinions as well, on what that means for practitioners of democracy promotion, whether that's foreign governments or NGOs or indigenous civil society groups. Where should their efforts be directed in societies where there isn't already that pre-existing set of norms that you described as existing in Britain before their transition or their full democratization?
Well, I mean, I think there's very little that outsiders can do in terms of making sort of transitions happen. I think the best thing that outsiders can do is really, do a good job of tracking and disseminating what's really happening. So I think some of the best role that international agencies or international NGOs can do is just document what's happening, but do so, without try to do so without following fads and taken for a ride by governments. And I say that as a cautionary tale because of sort of having followed what has happened in Turkey, and of course Turkey is sort of a leader in the pack in terms of this dissolution into a failed democracy. And there were a good period of 3 or 4 years when the liberal norms in Turkey were being badly undermined, while international human rights agencies and various NGOs were still sort of trumpeting Turkey as a wonderfully successful democracy. And I think so the international community doesn't always do a very good job, but if there is a job to be done, is to actually sort of document really what's going on in the judicial system, whether media freedoms are violated or not. And I think those are really the best and the most really that the outsiders can do, in my view.
Professor Levitsky, thoughts on outsiders, but also on civil society groups or indigenous democracy promoters? Well,
I agree with Dani that there's not a heck of a lot that external actors can do, particularly in the contemporary period. In the 1990s, it was a bit easier because given the brief period of sort of Western liberal hegemony, virtually every elite in almost every developing country in the world had very, very strong incentive to be on good terms with the West, and so they were very keen to get advice and follow the lead of external actors. We're in a very different world 25 years later. It's certainly the case that democracy can emerge and succeed and take root without deep-seated liberal norms. There are many, many cases in Latin America, Southern Europe, and elsewhere. And there are cases in which this is Dani's second path to democracy, in which a stalemate, a conflict between rival groups in society, maybe elite, maybe not so elite, leads to democracy as kind of a second best compromise that eventually takes hold, that works for people, and that leads to sort of the opposite sequence, not liberal norms giving rise to democracy, but democracy being adopted sometimes by accident, sometimes by compromise, and giving rise to democratic norms. What outside actors can do is help. I mean, what is critical to getting that compromise, you need to have more than one side. If the government has all the resources and the opposition is starved to death, like in Russia today, there can't be any compromise. And so making sure that independent media and opposition groups and civil society groups have some resources so they can contest for power, they continue to exist, which is a real problem in a number of regimes in the world today. That's one thing that outside actors can do. Make sure that there's some dispersion of resources in society.
Okay. I think I'd like to open it up for questions from our guests. Sir. Yes. I'm not sure what.
Yes, it's Mike here.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Klaus Rudischhauser. I represent the European Union in Mexico as ambassador. And so we're looking forward to possibly have yet another populist win in a few months in Mexico. But I would like to challenge some of the statements that have been made and question some of the statements because it just is not the same thing whether you get a populist in an old democracy as in the US or whether you get a populist in a young democracy as in Hungary or Poland for that matter. or whether you get that in a nascent democracy in Africa. I would warn against sort of painting everything with the same color, because it is not the same thing. You have very, very different reasons why Trump has been winning and why, for example, Orban in Hungary has been winning, because the historical situation is totally different, and I would propose to differentiate a little bit more.
Isn't that what I did?
I didn't feel it like that. By the way, you mentioned in passing Africa. In the last 10 years, we have had surprising successes in Africa with constitutional changes of government in a whole range of countries. So for the moment, certainly in Africa, there is a different trend. This was not the same 10 years ago, but in the last 5 or 10 years, we have had quite a few countries in Africa with a normal transition, or with presidents stepping down at the end of their constitutional mandate, allowing for elections. So I think that is also a point to be made. Then I would also hold that there is also a certain degree of influence that the international community can have, and there are checks and balances. That does not change the situation in the country, but there is a level of influence that you can have. We as European Union, for example, have quite severe sanctions for Venezuela. We have quite severe sanctions for Russia. So there are, we have an international system of law on many, many respects, and we can mobilize that, and we should probably mobilize it a bit more. Certainly the European Union is using that. Not everybody is using it, but we are using this to differentiate how we engage with countries where we see that democracy is not respected. And then finally, on this whole, let's say, thing that democracies are going down and populists are taking over. How many countries do we have where a populist has been elected a second term? Most of the time, we have seen that in Europe in recent years, there's a populist or a populistic party that wins the elections once, and the next elections are much more reasonable again. And so I would also say one also needs to look there. I would be, for example, very worried if Trump wins a second term. Then you have real reason to be worried. But we will see whether it happens. But I think we need to differentiate a little bit more if we want to draw some, let's say, useful conclusions. And I'm not sure democracy, liberal democracy, is really so much threatened as it has been appearing in the discussion.
All right, I have a tendency not to be very articulate and present my ideas very clearly, but my point was that populism is threatening democracies in Latin America and a handful of other places, but it's not populism. It is not populism, but rather polarization, rooted in rising inequality and reaction to ethnic diversity that's challenging democracy in the advanced industrialized country. I'm not claiming that populism is threatening democracies in Europe and the United States. Two other points. I think you're absolutely right about Africa. Africa belies this claim that democracy is in retreat globally. If anything, there has been forward motion in a important handful of cases in Africa. I totally agree. But with all due respect, EU pressure on Venezuela and Russia, I think, makes my point that international actors can't do a heck of a lot.
Okay. Sir.
Two questions, one for Professor Levitsky. You seem to I mean, your take, I think, is that the polarization has some thing to do with the underlying demography of the political parties in the U.S. So I would appreciate your comments on if you see any path out of this polarization, or if you don't, if you have any normative recommendation with respect to it. Dani, I think you have a good point conceptually, that maybe we are at the juncture in which liberal democracy needs a New Deal 2.0. Perhaps because we had, after all, a protracted, rather than a Great Depression, a very protracted kind of Great Depression after the 2008 crisis. So Could you elaborate a little bit? I think you're calling it economic populism. Maybe we should find another name, but a more suitable name. But what would be the thrust of your New Deal 2.0?
Shall I start? We should never go too far in predicting the effects of demography on politics. Politics has a way of rearing its own independent head, so one never knows for sure. But I think that I guess an optimistic scenario, which is not an unrealistic scenario, is at least in the United States, is that the Republican coalition, electoral coalition, is non-viable in the medium run. That very soon, and this is, if you look at the youth vote, this becomes markedly clear. Very soon, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to win elections at the national level based on small-town white Christians, and so the Republican Party electoral coalition is viable in the short run, not viable in the long run. So the best case scenario is that this strategy, what is essentially under Trump become a white nationalist strategy, that gets an electoral thumping. That fails so miserably that Republicans are forced to fairly radically reconfigure their coalition and adapt themselves to a more diverse society. I think that's a plausible path forward. The question is, when will that happen, and how much damage will they do between now and then?
I use the term economic populism in particular to get a rise out of the audience especially when there are Latin Americans. But I agree, it's not it's not the term that matters, it's the content, and therefore you're right to ask. So I think the answer is that it depends which country you're talking about. But if it's the United States, I would mention at a minimum the following items. One is cutting down the financial sector to size and significant amount of financial regulation, including regulation of cross-border flows and restoring capital account autonomy to countries. Second, I would mention progressive taxation of wealth in particular. I would say a significant ramp up of public investment in infrastructure. I would mention a significant rise of the minimum wage or expansion of earned income tax credits. Finally, I would say a kind of much more explicit and self-conscious, and again, to get a rise out of this audience, I'll call it industrial policy. But you might want to call it sort of productive policies or productivist policies that target the most innovative sectors of the U.S. economy in terms of technology innovation and try to find ways of disseminate these technologies more broadly through smaller and medium-sized enterprises and suppliers, with the active role of the public sector acting as a catalyst for that. Those would be the various elements that I would try to look for.
Okay. We're close out of time, but I do want to get some more questions. I'm going to go, ma'am, you there, and sir there. One question each, and please be brief because we're running out of time, and I'd like to get both of you to get your question in. Go ahead, ma'am.
I want to thank you very much for very interesting two presentations. I want to throw another ball into the field and see how you both see it. For a long time, I've been struck by, if you like, how so many people in America aren't thinking enough about the rise of China and the rise of the South, if I can put it that way, and what it means. And Ricardo made a comment in a rather weird conversation at Davos where he said, well, he thought that the rise of the South is causing ructions in first world politics, if I can put it that way, this is not part of the discussion. And when you talk about sort of economic populism in America, and that's what you're saying, which is interesting, I'm just sort of, there's a missing conversation here about China and the rise of the South, Indonesia, and so on, which is profound for what you're talking about.
Now, make quickly your question, then two quick responses if we can. Very quickly, please. I've been
Gentlemen,
given the
thank
red
you.
line.
I'd appreciate hearing what specific actions, recommendations would you have for, say, Harvard and MIT? And what's the right way to frame what these universities should be doing? Is it our goal to help bridge the divide between red and blue, left and right? The reason I ask, and if that's not the question, what is? The reason I ask specifically about that is I sense that just framing the issue that way is perceived as biased towards red and right here in Cambridge. And that many members of the MIT and Harvard communities aren't interested at all in helping bridge the divide, but see Trump as an opportunity to reinforce their position and become further entrenched.
Thank you. We have Rise of the South, and we have the role of Cambridge and MIT. Do you want to take Rise of the South, Professor Levitsky?
Rise of the South.
I'll take Rise of the South, and then you'll take the University. Go ahead. Great. Thank you.
Go for it.
Very briefly, I mean, I think this is a critical issue, and I think the impasse we face there is because all the arrangements for our global economy in the last 3 decades have been predicated on the idea that countries like China would eventually converge to a kind of sort of Western economic model or sort of, you know, the kind of, and I think it's quite clear that that is not happening, and I think there's good reason that is not happening or should not be happening. So I think the high-level answer to your question, I think, is that we need to envisage a kind of a model of globalization that understands the diversity of different economic systems, different types of capitalisms around the world, and thinks about globalization not as trying to homogenize those differences away, but establishing traffic rules whereby they can exist side by side. And that would be a different kind of globalization.
So I don't have too many great insights here. I mean, this is this problem, which I think you correctly identify, is what happens when a polity, a society, gets sliced into populist versus anti-populist. I used to watch my Latin American elite friends suffer under this sort of populist, anti-populist divide and criticize the elites for their inability to appeal to the masses. And now suddenly, here I am being targeted by the populists in my own country. I think there are, so for sure, so the danger is, of course, we're now all in one political party in elite universities, which is insane. We're at a point where many of my colleagues, and I should say me, rarely even met a Trump voter. That's a crazy situation to be in. It's a very unhealthy situation for a democracy to be in, where we do not know anybody in our social networks who vote for the other party. What can Harvard do? Harvard obviously should be inviting regularly speakers, visitors from the other side, should be engaging in high-profile public and intellectual debate. They should be recruiting students from across the country. Harvard actually does a decent job of that, and it's going to have to be. It has to be very careful that to do what universities first and foremost should be doing, which is maintaining an atmosphere of intellectual dialogue and debate. Partially for strategic reasons, because every time there's some kind of a crazy incident, even if it's a very minor one, in which intellectual debate is perceived to be shut down, that gets played over and over again on the hour on Fox News, and it feeds this polarization. It feeds a right-wing reaction. So universities have to be very self-conscious in doing what they historically done naturally, but in taking steps to ensure that we have a diversity of viewpoints and that we have high-profile debates.
Please join me in thanking our speakers.